Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
The peak no one saw coming. Is this year's oil crash a one-off or a meaningful transition away from fossil fuels? But who will take their place? We look at the super majors harnessing wind, solar, and electricity. And 5 years on from Paris, as world leaders meet to commemorate the climate accord, I speak to then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon about what the next 5 years will bring. I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Now, for more than a century, energy supply has been dominated by fossil fuels and the companies that extract, refine, and distribute crude. But as governments grow more climate conscious and the price of renewable energy falls dramatically, there's a new generation of energy giants having their moment in the sun.
After a century defined by big oil, there's a new generation of energy giants on the horizon. 4 companies, Enel, Iberdrola, NextEra Energy, and Ørsted, are on the cusp of a breakthrough. Ever cheaper solar panels and wind turbines are beginning to dominate new power installations, threatening the growth of natural gas and upending energy markets. Renewables are now the cheapest form of new electricity in most parts of the world. Wind and solar supply about 9% of electricity globally, and their share will rise to 56% by mid-century, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. NextEra is the world's biggest investor-owned producer of solar and wind energy and has enough renewable capacity to power Belgium. In its home state of Florida, it still owns power plants that are run on fossil fuels, but its big goal is to install 30 million more solar panels in the state by 2030. Enel is Europe's biggest utility. Based in Italy, it operates more than 30 countries, including Morocco, South Africa, Chile, India, and Canada. Although about 40% of the company's 87 gigawatt capacity is generated from fossil fuels, their plan is to spend $190 billion over the next 10 years to double their renewable portfolio. Formerly known as Danish Oil and Natural Gas, Ørsted has shed its fossil fuel assets and developed clean energy around the world. About a quarter of the world's at-sea wind farms are run by Ørsted, and it has plans to double capacity by 2050. Iberdrola has been building hydroelectric dams and onshore wind farms for years. The Spanish company went on a buying spree in 2020, investing 10 billion euros with aims to up renewable capacity to 60 gigawatts. The global hunt is on for places where the sun always shines and the wind blows steadily. Mega-sized solar farms cover large swaths of deserts in Morocco, Chile, and Australia, and the wind battle is happening increasingly at sea. Ørsted is involved in a sea grab to install skyscraper high wind turbines surrounding Europe. The area of these offshore wind projects represented here by the blue dots rival the landmass of some inhabited islands. Despite the reach of these Western companies, some of the largest wind and solar capacities will likely come from Chinese state-owned businesses. In 2017, 2 giants merged to form China Energy Investment Corp. The company has nearly 40 gigawatts of renewable power, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Big Oil, however, is not out of the picture. Via deep research and development budgets, they could corner the market on new technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture. Royal Dutch Shell and BP have already stepped into the arena by investing in renewable companies and electric car charging networks. If the 20th century was a story of oil, then this will be the century of electricity.
Big oil has to keep up or risk being left behind. 1 year ago, if anyone in the industry had said the moment of peak oil had passed, they would have been laughed off the drilling rig. But then 2020 happened. Planes were grounded, offices went dark, and everyone stayed home. And British oil giant BP made a historic call. Humanity's demand for oil will never reach the heights of 2019 again. Our climate reporter Jess Schenkelman joins me now to discuss this all. So we have the industry discussing whether or not we've reached peak oil or not. But obviously this has come so much sooner than many were expecting.
Well, yeah, and the whole point about this is the industry is debating it. I mean, go back a couple of years, we were writing about this idea of peak demand, but it was environmentalists talking about it, kind of people working in the technology industry looking into the future. Now you've got companies like BP and OPEC actually actively considering that this may well have happened.
So now if we do get a vaccine, which we have in the United Kingdom, but we get it worldwide, what's the outlook then?
At the moment, we've got this convergence of the pandemic having a major effect on economies, which is weakening oil demand. Then you've got battery costs are falling, which is making electric cars more attractive. And added to that, you've got governments like in the UK, France, Canada, California, banning the sale of new internal combustion engine cars. And those three things together are kind of creating the momentum, potentially creating a tipping point that means even as the vaccine comes along, we may well see electric cars continue to take off and oil demand suppressed. So Bloomberg Intelligence had some research out this week, and they think that in 2025, oil demand is still going to be 1 million barrels a day less than it was in 2019, suggesting that we may well have passed that peak.
The other interesting thing, me and you and I are talking about peak oil demand, but Rystad put out research talking about the fact that in 2050, even if there's not a ton of demand because of the transition, because everything that's happening in the energy market, there might actually not be the supply there. We might have a supply crunch.
Right, this is where it starts to get really confusing because you're getting peak demand and then peak supply responding to peak demand. What is going on here? They're talking about transition risks. So this is, remember Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, he's now working on climate change with the UK government. He has always warned that one of the biggest risks to financial markets is that they don't see this coming, they don't plan for the change, and what happens is you just end up with people falling off cliff edges, very messy transition, companies going bust, and that's the risk that you really want to avoid.
Because some parts of the world are ahead of the energy transition, but some parts of the world are going to be reliant on fossil fuels.
Yeah, and what we've seen is that when governments set policies, sometimes things happen actually much faster than they were intending. So in the UK, they set a target to end the use of coal-fired power plants for electricity. And actually, we're already having coal-free days. We're having coal-free months because...
Right, we're like 5 years ahead of the target.
Yeah, because investors saw what was coming down the line and they just acted.
And that likely could happen with the internal combustion engine to EVs. You're not going to buy an internal combustion engine car if you know that they're going to be banned in the next 5-10 years, are you?
Exactly. I mean, people buy a new car every 4 or 5 years. So if you're thinking of replacing your car now, then you're going to think, what, maybe 2 more cars. But yeah, exactly. 2029, you're not going to go into a forecourt and buy a diesel car.
Bloomberg's climate reporter Jess Schenkelman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, the man behind the Paris Climate Accord. Ban Ki-moon says the climate agenda has suffered without U.S. leadership. My conversation with the former head of the UN next. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Let's get a recap of your Green in Brief with Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know. The UK wants to be at the vanguard of the fight against climate change. Boris Johnson is pledging the deepest cuts to greenhouse gas emissions in the G20. It puts Britain on track to deliver net zero emissions by the middle of the century. Hydrogen power firms are uniting with the mission: make production cheaper. An alliance of 7 of the world's biggest producers is aiming to bring down costs and build 25 gigawatts of capacity by 2026. That's about a quarter of the UK's total energy capacity. Over 700,000 people in Southern California are facing power outages. Strong winds are battering the state, fanning the flames of wildfires. Electricity firms are turning off the power to prevent electrical wires sparking new blazes. A drought across much of the state is making the situation worse. Now you can bet on the cost of water in California. The precious resource is joining gold and oil as a commodity traded on Wall Street. The futures are the first of their kind in the U.S. and come amid concerns that water is becoming more scarce in some of the driest parts of the world. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York. Annmarie, back to you.
When Ban Ki-moon was elected as the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, his predecessor said to him, "You're about to take on the most impossible job on Earth." His first major initiative was the 2007 Climate Change Summit in Bali, and his focus on the environment has held throughout his time at the top job. It culminated with the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which he told me was the proudest moment of his career. Half a decade later, as world leaders gather to commemorate the anniversary of the agreement, he worries about the progress that's been made.
Governments are failing to address the very real and immediate impacts caused by climate change. Now we must take action, urgent action, before it is too late. While we are fighting the coronavirus at one front, but we have to not forget that coronavirus and climate change are two sides of one coin. So we have to cure the fundamental reasons. That is climate change.
As Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon told me he relied on the buy-in from the United States to act as a leader when it came to climate change. But in the absence of that leadership, Ban Ki-moon told me other countries are stepping up to try to fill that gap, and he's hopeful in what he calls a return to normalcy under President-elect Joe Biden.
China has declared during last General Assembly of the United Nations that President Xi Jinping declared that by 2060, China will achieve carbon neutrality. Then India also aims to reduce its carbon intensity by 1/3 by the end of this decade. What is most encouraging is that the President-elect of the United States, Joe Biden, has declared that on the very day of his inauguration as president, the United States will return to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and will also try to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, investing $2 trillion. And that's very good news.
Since leaving the UN, Ban Ki-moon has taken on a number of different climate projects, and in January, he'll be chairing the first international summit on climate adaptation.
Adaptation is much more important and much more useful in addressing climate change. Of course, you have to mitigate, but at this time, we have to pay more investment in adaptation. The summit is crucial for setting us on the right path to scale up the world's efforts in adapting to inevitable effects of climate change and laying the groundwork ahead of COP26 in November in Glasgow. And this year really could be the last chance. We have to set the world on the right path.
The lifelong diplomat ended our conversation with an appeal to global leaders.
We have been suffering enough by natural disasters. Wildfires in the western area of the United States and Australia, and the hottest ever temperature recorded in the Death Valley in California. I am really asking world leaders to unite and show their global leadership, working together with the business communities, scientists, and civil societies. People are urging, particularly young people. Just look at the case of Greta Thunberg. And there are thousands of such young people who are just crying out to current global leaders to do much more for their future.
While Ban Ki-moon is pushing for a multinational approach, there are efforts underway in individual countries to tackle climate change. The German Green Party held its annual conference at the end of November and unveiled the most radical spending package that the fiscally conservative nation has ever seen.
As Europe's biggest economy tackles the crisis brought on by the pandemic, one political party wants it to focus on another crisis as well: climate change. At next year's election, Germany's Green Party will be a serious contender for the chancellery for the first time in its 40-year history. Its plan? to accelerate the exit from coal power and expand the country's renewables. To pay for it, a massive green spending plan that could keep Germany from returning to its prized black zero, its balanced budget.
We want to establish a 500 billion investment fund over the next 10 years, and we can finance it because we want to issue new bonds from the Federal Republic, and the good news is we don't have to pay any interest rates for it, because now the interest rates for German bonds, if you look for 10-year bonds, is negative.
With no interest payments, issuing new bonds might seem like a no-brainer, but financing the investments will still come with a hefty price tag. The Greens want to do something that's been taboo in German politics: change constitutional rules that keep a cap on public debt.
We don't want to abolish it, but want to reform the debt brake in the German constitution, and we want to finance investments in the future over issuing bonds, because they have a positive reinvestment. We can have a positive impact also on the economy, but also on the German budget, because it will gain new tax income, for example.
Germany is already set to take on over 300 billion euros of new debt this year and next to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. The question is, will Germany's Greens be able to convince the public to dig deep again, setting aside the black zero in favor of a green future?
That's the view from Germany. Next up, China. Coming up, one man is transforming the nation's approach to climate change and taking a global lead on policy. Who is the man behind one of the most ambitious carbon plans in the world? This is Bloomberg Green. In London, I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Now, for years, China defended the right to emit. But in September, it took the world by surprise. The biggest emitter on the planet vowed to become carbon neutral by 2060. Meet the man behind the plan, the veteran Communist Party bureaucrat who quietly changed climate history.
In the past decade, no politician has probably been more influential in shifting China's climate policy than Xi Jinping. As China's lead negotiator at the United Nations climate change conferences, he's been critical to forging climate agreements on the international stage. Now he's a special advisor to China's environmental ministry and the head of a leading institute for climate and sustainability research. A study done by that institute contributed to China's decision to be carbon neutral by 2060. So how is China going to achieve its carbon neutrality goals in time? And what role will this climate veteran continue to play? After working for China's Environmental Protection Ministry for almost a decade, Xi was appointed as its head in 1993.
During Xi's tenure at the Environmental Protection Ministry, a management system for major air and water pollutants were put in place. In addition, environmental targets started to be included in China's 5-year plans.
He resigned in 2005 after a series of chemical plant explosions in China's Jilin province. The explosions were caused by the improper storage of dangerous chemicals and left 6 dead and dozens injured. A local river was also polluted by leaked chemicals, and tens of thousands of residents had to be evacuated.
His resignation came as the environmental agency criticized local officials for covering up the accident and for this blind pursuit of economic development, which damaged China's environment. But the resignation appeared to be only a blip in his career, as Xi later assumed the role of vice chairman of the National Development and Reform Commission. At the time, the NDRC, China's top economic planner, was responsible for making environmental policy, so Xi continued to have a leading role in China's climate strategies.
In 2007, Xi was appointed as China's lead climate negotiator at the UN climate change conferences. By then, 4 decades of breakneck economic growth had turned China into the world's biggest carbon emitter. Steadily, though, the country's stance has shifted.
大家对中国的这个煤炭和煤电的发展呢，一直有些各种各样的议论。其实中国的煤炭的消费量，从2013年到2015年，实际上已经是达到了峰值。 中国的环境污染问题、雾霾的问题、大气污染的问题，这个很多问题其实它的主要来源还是煤炭。现在呢，这个对煤和这个火电各个部门呢，对它的认识逐步的清楚了。
We know that Xie played quite an important role in proposing ambitious climate targets for China, which were eventually adopted by the country's top leaders. He is very well versed in sort of the party structure and the party priorities, as well as international climate priorities. So he knows how to translate the international pressures into better Chinese policies.
我们是发展国家，我们要发展，我们要消除贫困，我们要保护环境，该做的我们都做了，我们已经做的你们还没有做到，你有什么资格在这里讲这些道理给我？
So Xie is known as a very candid, tough negotiator in international climate talks. At the Durban talks in 2011, a video of Xie repeatedly banging a table over what he believed were hypocritical demands by developed countries was widely broadcast in China. And yet his counterparts continued to speak to a sense of humor and his general likability.
所以在这个谈判场上，他只有对手，有朋友，没有敌人。 所以你能够坚定地维护本国的利益，但是在这个过程当中又能够维护人类的多边的这个利益，找到一个最佳结合点，这就是一个谈判代表他应该具备的品质。
Beyond the negotiating table, Xie has a personal commitment to fight for change after traveling to parts of the world affected by the climate crisis.
我从事气候变化工作以后，到南极，到北极。 到一些小岛屿国家，到一些不发达国家，到他们最基层，到农村，去看了看，确实看到了这个气候环境对这些国家的经济社会发展。你看到了这些问题、这些危害、这些影响，也看到这些工作能够给这些地方的老百姓带来的这个生活质量的改善。 花钱并不多，只要你选准了这个技术跟选准了方向，其实就可以，既应对了气候变化，又改善了生活，又摆脱了贫困，又能够发展当地的经济。
In 2017, Xie received a $2.5 million award for his efforts to tackle climate change. He donated the money to his alma mater, Tsinghua University, hoping to encourage the next generation of climate leaders. He's now the head of the university's Institute of Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and his team's research has helped set China's goal to become carbon neutral by 2060.
So One Climate Institute that works with Xie's Institute at Tsinghua has laid out a plan of increasing renewable and nuclear energy and completely phasing out coal power. Under this particular plan, coal-fired electricity would be eliminated by 2050, and China's energy mix would undergo a dramatic transformation. We've also seen these estimates that something like $15 trillion will need to be invested over the next 30 years to meet these targets.
不能用传统的这些生产方式、生活方式、消费模式、传统的技术，要想实现这些目标是很困难的，甚至是不可能的。我们必须要创新，必须要转型，而且要加速转型，这个大力的创新。只有这样呢，才能够真正的实现这个目标。
That's it for this week, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. From London, I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.